You know, I haven't actually personally met Chanan, and I wasn't familiar with who he was or his music. And when I first heard it, I found it very interesting, very rhythmic, melodic.
He has a very unique sense of rhythm. I can always tell that it's him from his quirky and cheeky kind of rhythmic phrasing and grooves. There's that funk in his playing, which is very enticing.
Checked out his compositions, and again, I was stunned. I'm like, wow, why haven't I heard of this guy before?
He's got great feel. He's technically he's just off the scale. But it's all about the groove as well with Chan. He's got both sides of that coin, and that's a real rarity.
My father is Indian and my mother is Welsh. My father grew up in Africa, in Nairobi, and my mother in Wales. So I'm half Indian and half Welsh. My dad was into all different kinds of music, and he liked a lot of popular music at the time. This would be in the 1970s. And so I remember hearing, groups like Parliament and Funkadelic and James Brown, and I really loved it. Even back then when I was in the car or in the home and he was playing it, I used to love listening to it. So I started doing classical guitar lessons, and I really wasn't interested in classical music. At that time I was really into Jimi Hendrix, and my little town in Wales, I got a little bit of a reputation for being this little Jimi Hendrix clone, I used to play these gigs in these godforsaken pubs, where you're lucky to walk out with your legs intact kind of thing. And then I started to get into more sort of technical guitar players like, I really liked Steve Vai and Joe Satriani, and I thought those guys were fantastic. I used to think, if only I could play like that. So I spent a few years playing that style. But then I started to get into jazz.
Discovered that even though he'd sort of come from this blues jazz background and I'd come from more the rock metal side, we'd sort of gone on this journey and sort of arrived at a similar place. We were both fascinated by sort of modern classical composition, soundtrack composers. I suppose the music of Frank Zappa was a key influence for both of us. I suppose we both love complexity and extended harmony and exploring different rhythms, scales and modalities. So it was brilliant rediscovering Chanan's music and realizing that, gosh, there was all this amazing body of work that he'd done.
My main instrument is a guitar, so some pieces will be composed there. Sometimes I might hear something, or I might just write some technical, theoretical ideas down a notation and then input into Sibelius and listen back and see if any of it is any good. I like to sit at the piano and compose. Great. Purely for the fact that I don't have an assured technique on the piano, so I'm not restricted by habitual tendencies. If you've been playing an instrument for a long time, you tend to fall into these, familiar shapes and patterns. So if I sit at the piano, I have to use my head instead of the physicality side of things. And so you're forced to create different sounds.
Apart from being a very well-rounded guitar player and a great musician, Chanan is a very intellectual guy. He's interested in music theory and philosophy, and has a vast knowledge of all this stuff. It's not surprising that you hear influences from European art music in one part, and then could go into an improvised section that is more inspired by jazz and the American art forms. So very unpredictable and exciting music, I think.
Chanan's music is very interesting. You can tell he's a very eclectic composer with a very deep knowledge in traditional music. You can find different styles together, crashing together, making a conflict, like harmonic elements you would find in Schoenberg's music, Stravinsky's music.
I also was interested in 20th century classical music, so I would go to these late night jams and then come back home, my little flat and my table lamp, and just go through Stravinsky scores and Debussy scores until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, just listening, following the dots and trying to get this music into my head.
It's quite dazzling at times, just to see how he's put together his music with all these different tonal elements and all this rich instrumentation. Which has inspired me listening and thinking, I'd like to do that too. When I first heard him, heard some of his orchestral pieces and thinking, wow, that's brilliant.
Doesn't necessarily have to be written in a day or in an hour or whatever. It's a process. It can take days, it can take weeks, it can take months sometimes. This piece is called Isma. It's a piece I'm working on at the moment. Isma is a contraction for Isabel and Mathilde, which are the names of my daughters. When I'm composing orchestral music, I usually write the notes in a music notation program called Sibelius. Here you can see the introduction, the piano introduction to the piece, and it's a very accurate representation of what I have in my head. Then once that is exported and imported into Logic, it looks like this, where you have these blocks of data which represent the MIDI information. The assignment of the orchestral instrument plays it back. It's very precise and very accurate, and it sounds computer generated, which I don't like. So I have to move things around a lot. This sounds like a simple process. However, I have to do a lot of tweaking in Logic to make it sound realistic. It's a very laborious task, and it takes a long time, especially when you have to do this for each instrument. And in this particular piece, there are over 40 instruments playing, so it takes a long time.
Ideas for composition can come from anywhere. It could be something someone says, it could be a place, it could be a sentence in a book or something I've read in a newspaper, almost anything. And it can start from something very small and manifest into something big. And you can take it anywhere you want. You know, if you've got the compositional tools to do it, you can create anything from very basic ideas.
Okay, right. Second time round, you've got a lot more succinct. Right, but not as funny as the first. London, and I started getting sort of into the sort of funk scene, the late night jam scene there. This would be the time of acid jazz music. It was kind of quite popular at the time, and did a couple of gigs. Frequented a place called Iceni. Was part of the house band, and this is where I used to play with the likes of Questlove, the Roots. The Roots were actually signed to Talking Loud Records at the time. I don't think Questlove was known as Questlove back then. He was just this great drummer that would come in, sit down behind the kit for 20 minutes and just hold down this fantastic groove. So that was really interesting, making a transition from jazz to sort of this kind of funk music. So this club was a good learning place for me because I got to play with these people. One night JK from Jamiroquai came down. Other times the JBs were there. I mean, it was just great sort of celeb hangout place. You know, guys would be touring, would be in town, would come here in the evening just to sort of jam. So that was quite an education, and it was a bit of a challenge trying to merge what I'd learned from my conservatorium days with this kind of raw energy. These guys who had just learned music from intuitively, let's say. So I learned a lot from them, and how not to play and how to groove for a long time, you know, for 10, 15 minutes without playing a guitar solo. So that was quite a challenge and a very important part of my education.
Although I like the dissonance and complexity of jazz and modern classical music, I also like the relatively simpler structures found in pop music. Of course, I had preferences for certain types of pop music from the 60s onwards, I suppose, but my interest waned greatly by the time we got to the end of the 90s. I have a lot of unfinished songs that I'm keen to get recorded, but the challenge is trying to find great vocalists who can interpret the music in a convincing way. I worked with 3 great female vocalists who helped realize some of my songs. That material was performed and recorded by vocalists Debbie French, Pam Nurse, and incognito vocalist Imani. And much of that stuff came out on my album The Garden Sessions.
Who wants to cause the cup of fate to overflow and flood the fields where children play? It's only just a garden anyway.
I then started to get interested in jazz. I heard a cassette of Charlie Parker, I'd heard some Miles Davis. It was unintelligible to me at that time, but I knew I wanted to play it. So I decided to move out to Perth, Western Australia, and studied at a conservatorium out there.
So the first year was difficult, making that transition from a rock guitar player to a jazz guitar player. I used to spend hours listening to, people like Chick Corea, McCoy Tyne. I was really interested in piano players, more so than saxophone players. I love the way the sound, particularly Chick Corea. I love the way his Fender Rhodes playing in the early 70s with Return to Forever. The sound was just awesome, I thought. Most of the transcriptions, most of the learning I did was from, piano players. But as a guitarist, you're faced with a number of technical challenges because certain intervals and certain notes that are played on the piano are quite difficult to emulate on the guitar. But I'd spend hours and hours writing down these transcriptions and learning them on the guitar.
Well, the first time I saw Chanan was on YouTube. He was playing this Cannonball Adderley solo, and I was just totally blown away. You know, he just nailed it, and I sent him a response on his YouTube channel or an email, and you know, told him that, you know, really appreciated his hard work and dedication, you know, to do something like that.
And I collaborated with Jeff Lorber and John Medeski on my last album, Ephemeral Morph. I mean, I've been a fan of John Medeski's for quite some time, you know. He's a great player. He's really, you know, he really tries to go for different things, you know. He's one of those great improvisers that takes a lot of chances, and it was an honor to have him play on my album. You know, I really like the guy. He's great.
Shannon's guitar playing is quite remarkable, to say the least.
I was also impressed with the commitment that he puts into guitar playing. Is not only through his composing, but also through the guitar playing, putting the hours to perfect the technical skills he needs to actually say what he wants to say in his music. And that's something we share, although we play very different styles.
The technical skill in his playing and the musicianship, to be able to have a voice like that through your instrument and through your playing, is something we all aspire to, and he really had it, and of course he still has it, even more now.
I think it's very fresh, it's very different. Anything that's rhythmic and has a strong melodic bass is something that I can relate to.
If I had to describe Chanan to someone that's never heard of him, you know, obviously he has his own voice, but I would say if you took like Frank Zappa and Frank Gambale, John McLaughlin, and Pat Metheny and rolled them all into one, that would describe Shannon's playing. Just an amazing musician.
like to do basically is take the harmonic ideas of 20th century classical music and fuse that with the groove and danceability of funk music. You couldn't really find more opposing styles than dodecaphonic music and funk music. So I like to put these two together and see what happens, and I think that's really one of the driving forces behind some of my music. And I also realized that generally when an audience is confronted with dodecaphonic music, highly dissonant chromatic music, people are horrified by this harmony. However, you put that harmony with a funk groove, let's say, something that's grooving, that's got a really good driving sort of consistency to it, you can put pretty much anything on top of it. You can even throw in odd, irregular times every now and then, and people will tolerate that a lot more. So I try and see how much I can get away with. I'm always trying to push it and seeing what people will tolerate. And so yeah, that's what I like to do, is try to find different styles of music and put them together and see if it works. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but it's an ongoing process, and it makes the compositional process much more interesting as well, because you're not confined to just one style, one technique, one habit. So yeah, that's what I like to do.
Thank you very much. This next piece we're going to play is called Manolo's Lawnmower. The idea of this piece is that there's an underlying groove that's consistently intercepted with sort of short rhythmic cells and irregular tuplets. So it's kind of conflicting music, if you like, where each attribute, that being the groove and the irregularity, competing for dominance, let's say. So we're going to play that for you now. It's one of the trickiest pieces that we play, and just to show you how tricky it is, we'll probably put in a few mistakes. Part of being a musician is that you can express yourself, you can be creative, and you can channel it through something that's positive. I think when you're young, you can be, kids are instinctively creative, and as you get older, you're told to be more logical, and so you lose that creativity sometimes. But being a musician, being an artist, whatever it is, you've always got the opportunity to express it in a positive way. The bad thing about being a musician is that a lot of the times people don't take it seriously. I don't think people see it as a serious profession, and so there's a lot of politics involved in that.